What if one bold decision could ignite a chain reaction that changes the course of history? This is the story of the Trenton family, a tale of bravery, sacrifice, and resilience that spans 7 generations. It all started with Jacob Trenton, a retired Marine who defied the odds and the prejudice of his small town by adopting a black child, Elijah. The whispers turned to threats and the danger grew, but Jacob stood firm. Little did anyone know, this act of defiance would spark a legacy of strength that would be tested time and again as his family faced hate, violence, and battles that could change the world. Would you have the courage to fight for what's right, even when the world is against you? If you're ready to dive into a story packed with action, suspense, and generational strength, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. What would you do if your family's courage was put to the ultimate test? Let us know in the comments below. In the quiet town of Willow Creek, a storm of whispers surrounded a man named Jacob Trenton. A retired Marine, Jacob had lived a solitary life since returning from service. Known for his stoic demeanor and deep sense of justice, he shocked the town when he announced he had adopted a child, a black boy named Elijah. The judgment came quickly and harshly. "They don't mix," sneered Roger Kemp, the owner of the local diner. "What does a white Marine know about raising a black child? He's just looking for attention," a woman whispered at the market. Jacob ignored the talk. He had no time for small minds. Elijah had been through more hardship in his 6 years of life than most of these people would ever understand. Orphaned in a tragic house fire, he had no family willing to take him in. When Jacob met him through a veterans community outreach program, something stirred in him, a desire to give the boy a chance. But Jacob's decision wasn't just controversial, it came with consequences. One evening, he walked into his favorite bar, the Rusty Nail, where conversations hushed upon his entry. As he ordered a beer, a man with a rough voice, Travis Lane, approached him. "You think you're some kind of hero, Trenton?" Travis spat, his breath heavy with whiskey. "We don't need your charity cases messing up our town." Jacob calmly sipped his beer. "I didn't adopt Elijah for you, Travis. I did it because he deserves a chance. If you've got a problem, it's your problem." But Travis wasn't done. With a swift motion, he grabbed Jacob's shirt. Before anyone could react, Jacob twisted Travis's arm behind his back and slammed him onto the bar. "Touch me again, and you'll regret it," Jacob warned, his voice like steel. Elijah, meanwhile, was adjusting to his new life in Jacob's small but cozy home. He adored Jacob, calling him Pops within days of moving in. Jacob, despite his rough exterior, showed the boy nothing but love. He taught Elijah how to ride a bike, helped him with his homework, and even began learning how to braid his hair after a crash course from YouTube. But the outside world wasn't as welcoming. At school, Elijah faced bullying from kids who echoed their parents' prejudices. One day, Jacob received a call from the principal. "Elijah's been in a fight," the principal said. When Jacob arrived, he found Elijah sitting outside the office, a bruise forming under his eye. He knelt in front of him. "What happened, buddy?" "They called me a name," Elijah said quietly. "Said I don't belong here." Jacob's jaw tightened. He didn't press further, but later that evening, he took Elijah to the woods behind their house. He set up tin cans on a fence post and handed the boy a BB gun. "Sometimes, life will knock you down," Jacob said as Elijah aimed at the cans. "People will try to make you feel small. But you stand tall, Elijah. You fight back, not with fists, but with strength and skill. Show them you're better than their hate." Elijah's face lit up when he hit his first target. As months turned into years, the relationship between Jacob and Elijah deepened. Jacob taught Elijah self-defense, discipline, and the importance of standing up for what was right. Elijah's confidence grew, but so did the hostility of the town. One night, Jacob heard a noise outside his house. Grabbing his shotgun, he moved quietly to the front door. Through the window, he saw 3 men setting fire to a cross on his lawn. "Stay inside," Jacob instructed Elijah, his voice firm but calm. He stepped onto the porch, shotgun in hand. "Leave now, or you'll regret it." The men turned, their faces masked. One of them held a baseball bat. "You're the one who doesn't belong here," the leader said. Jacob didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the air, the deafening sound echoing through the night. The men scattered like rats, but Jacob knew this was only the beginning. The next day, Sheriff Parker visited Jacob. "You're stirring up trouble," the sheriff said, though his tone wasn't entirely unsympathetic. This town doesn't change easy. Then it's time it did, Jacob replied. As the years passed, the tension in Willow Creek simmered. Elijah, now a teenager, had grown into a strong, intelligent young man. But the prejudice he and Jacob faced never fully disappeared. One fateful evening, as they drove back from a late basketball game, a black SUV began tailing them. Jacob noticed it immediately. His instincts, honed from years in the military, kicked in. Elijah, stay down, Jacob said, his voice steady but urgent. The SUV swerved ahead, forcing Jacob to stop. Four men jumped out, armed with bats and knives. You think you can play house with him and get away with it? One shouted. Jacob stepped out of the truck, his sidearm concealed beneath his jacket. Leave now, and no one gets hurt. The men laughed, advancing. But Jacob was prepared. He pulled his weapon, aiming with precision. You think I'm bluffing? He asked coldly. One of the men lunged, and Jacob fired a warning shot at the ground. The crack of the gun sent them scrambling, but not before one of them smashed the truck's windshield with a bat. As they sped off, Jacob knelt beside Elijah. You okay? Elijah nodded, his eyes wide but filled with admiration. You didn't even flinch, Pops. Back at home, Jacob patched up Elijah's scraped arm from the broken glass. I'm sorry you have to go through this, Jacob said, his voice heavy. Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder. You've taught me how to be strong, Pops. I'm not scared. The bond between them grew even stronger that night. While the town's prejudice remained, so did Jacob's resolve. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew Elijah was worth every battle. Years had passed, and Elijah, now in his 20s, had left Willow Creek to attend college in Chicago. The small-town life had given way to the bustling city, and for the first time, Elijah felt like he could breathe freely. But freedom came with its own challenges. While he excelled academically, the streets of Chicago were unforgiving, and Elijah soon learned that survival in the city required more than just book smarts. Back in Willow Creek, Jacob was growing older. He kept in touch with Elijah through frequent calls and occasional visits, but he missed the boy who had once looked to him as both protector and father. The town's hostility hadn't diminished entirely, but Jacob's reputation as a man you didn't cross kept the worst of it at bay. One evening, as Jacob sat on his porch cleaning an old rifle, his phone rang. It was Elijah, but his voice was strained. Pops, Elijah began, I need your help. Jacob's grip on the phone tightened. What's wrong? There's this gang. They've been hassling me for weeks. They want me to run drugs for them, and I told them no. Now they're threatening me, and my friend Marcus. Jacob didn't hesitate. I'm coming. Within hours, Jacob had packed a bag, strapped a pistol to his ankle, and loaded his truck. By the next day, he was standing in Elijah's cramped apartment, surveying the scene. The walls were lined with books and posters, but the air felt heavy with tension. Elijah introduced Jacob to Marcus, a wiry young man with sharp eyes and a nervous energy. They call themselves the Iron Wolves, Marcus explained. They run this whole block. You cross them, and they make your life hell. Jacob leaned back in his chair, his steely gaze fixed on Marcus. Do they carry weapons? Marcus nodded. Guns, knives, bats, whatever they can get their hands on. Jacob stood and began pacing. We're not going to wait for them to come to you. We're going to end this now. Elijah's eyes widened. Pops, this isn't Willow Creek. These guys don't scare easy. Jacob smirked. Neither do I. That night, they staked out the Iron Wolves hangout. A graffiti-covered warehouse on the edge of the neighborhood. Jacob had taught Elijah how to observe without being seen, and the lessons paid off as they watched the gang's movements from a shadowed alley. They've got at least 10 guys inside, Elijah whispered. Jacob nodded. We'll start by cutting off their legs. Without their money, they're nothing. Over the next week, Jacob and Elijah launched a calculated assault on the gang's operations. Using information gathered from Marcus, they sabotaged drug shipments, slashed tires on delivery vehicles, and anonymously tipped off the police about key locations. But the Iron Wolves were relentless. One evening, as Elijah and Marcus walked home, a black sedan screeched to a stop beside them. 3 men jumped out, guns drawn. You think you can mess with us and walk away? One snarled. Elijah stepped forward, shielding Marcus. I'm not afraid of you. Before the thug could respond, a shot rang out. The men froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. At the end of the alley stood Jacob, a rifle slung over his shoulder and a pistol aimed squarely at the lead thug. "Drop the guns," Jacob commanded, his voice cold and unyielding. The men hesitated, but when Jacob fired a second shot, this one just inches from the lead thug's foot, they complied. "Tell your boss this ends now," Jacob growled. "You come near my son again, and I won't miss." The gang retreated, but Jacob knew they wouldn't give up easily. That night, as they regrouped in Elijah's apartment, Jacob laid out a plan. "We're going to take down their leader," he said. "Cut off the head, and the body will fall." Marcus looked skeptical. "You're talking about Gabriel Steele Vasquez. He's untouchable." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "No one is untouchable." The next morning, they tracked Steele to his favorite haunt, an upscale nightclub guarded by armed men. Jacob studied the building, noting the entrances and exits. "We'll need a distraction," Jacob said. Marcus nodded. "I can handle that." That evening, as the nightclub buzzed with activity, Marcus set off a fire alarm in a nearby building. The chaos drew the attention of the nightclub's guards, leaving the rear entrance unguarded. Jacob and Elijah slipped inside, navigating the dimly lit corridors until they found Steele in a private lounge. The gang leader was flanked by 2 bodyguards, but Jacob moved with the precision of a trained soldier. In a blur of motion, he disarmed the first guard and incapacitated the second with a swift strike. Steele reached for a weapon, but Jacob leveled his pistol at him. "Don't," Jacob warned. Steele sneered. "You think you're the first to come after me? You're out of your depth, old man." Jacob smirked. "We'll see about that." With Elijah's help, they restrained Steele and left him for the police, along with evidence of his crimes gathered from the gang's operations. The takedown sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, and the Iron Wolves disbanded in the weeks that followed. As they walked home that night, Elijah looked at Jacob with a newfound respect. "You didn't have to do this, Pops. But you did." "Why?" Jacob placed a hand on his shoulder. "Because family means you fight for each other, no matter what." The ordeal left a lasting impression on Elijah, shaping him into a man who valued courage and resilience. Jacob returned to Willow Creek, proud of the man his son was becoming. Elijah's triumph over the Iron Wolves left a deep mark on his life, but it was only the beginning of his journey. Now in his 30s, Elijah had built a career as a civil rights attorney. He returned to Willow Creek often to visit Jacob, whose once steely frame had begun to bend under the weight of age. Still, Jacob remained sharp and proud, always eager to hear about Elijah's victories in court. Willow Creek had changed little over the years. The prejudice was quieter but not gone. When Elijah visited, he could still feel the stares of townsfolk who hadn't forgotten Jacob's decision to adopt him. However, there were glimmers of progress. A new community center had opened, funded by an anonymous donor. The whispers suggested Elijah was behind it, but he never confirmed or denied the rumors. One rainy autumn evening, Elijah sat across from Jacob at the kitchen table, recounting a case he'd won against a company accused of housing discrimination. Jacob smiled faintly, his fingers tapping the rim of his coffee mug. "You're doing good work, son," Jacob said. "But don't let your guard down. The world fights back when you push for change." Elijah chuckled. "You sound like you're giving me a mission briefing." Jacob's face darkened slightly. "Life's always a mission, Elijah. Don't forget that." The truth of Jacob's words became painfully clear a week later. Elijah was preparing for a high-profile case against a corrupt politician tied to a private militia when the threats began. Anonymous calls and emails demanded he drop the case, laced with promises of violence if he didn't. Elijah dismissed them at first, but when a brick smashed through his office window with a note reading, "You've been warned," he knew he couldn't ignore the danger. He called Jacob, who listened intently as Elijah explained the situation. "They're cowards," Jacob said. "But cowards with weapons can still be dangerous. I'll be there by morning." True to his word, Jacob arrived at Elijah's doorstep, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Inside were a handgun, ammunition, and a small arsenal of tactical gear. "You brought a war chest?" Elijah asked, half joking. Jacob's expression was grim. "You're my son. I'm not taking chances." The next evening, as Elijah worked late in his office, Jacob kept watch from the shadows outside. His instincts were razor-sharp, and he didn't have to wait long before trouble found them. A black van pulled up across the street, and 3 men emerged, their faces obscured by masks. Jacob's heart quickened. He reached for his pistol and moved silently to intercept them. The men advanced toward the building, one carrying a canister of gasoline. Jacob stepped out of the shadows, his weapon aimed. "Stop right there," he barked. The men froze, their hands hovering near concealed weapons. "You don't want to do this," Jacob continued, his voice low and steady. "Walk away, and I won't have to hurt you." One of the men smirked. "You're outnumbered, old man." Jacob didn't flinch. "That's your first mistake." The second man lunged, drawing a knife, but Jacob's reflexes were as sharp as ever. He disarmed the attacker with a swift twist and sent him sprawling with a kick. The others hesitated, realizing they'd underestimated their opponent. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, shattering the tension. One of the men fired, the bullet grazing Jacob's arm. Pain flared, but Jacob didn't falter. He returned fire, his shot striking the assailant's weapon and sending it clattering to the ground. The men scrambled back to the van, dragging their injured comrade with them. Jacob didn't pursue, he'd made his point. Inside, Elijah rushed to Jacob, his eyes wide with alarm. "Pops! You're bleeding." "It's just a scratch," Jacob said, brushing him off. "But this isn't over. These guys mean business." The following days were tense. Jacob stayed by Elijah's side, both as a protector and a strategist. They fortified Elijah's office and coordinated with law enforcement, though the latter offered little reassurance. One night, as they reviewed evidence in the case, Elijah turned to Jacob. "Why are you still doing this? You've done enough for me. You should be back home, taking it easy." Jacob looked at him, his gaze unwavering. "Elijah, I didn't fight for you all these years to let anyone take you down now. You're my son. That means I stand with you, always." The final confrontation came 2 nights later. Elijah and Jacob had anticipated another attack, and this time, they were ready. When the same black van appeared, Jacob positioned himself on the roof of a nearby building, his rifle trained on the street below. Elijah stayed inside, ready to call for help if needed. The attackers approached cautiously, their movements more coordinated. This wasn't a scare tactic, it was an execution. As they moved closer, Jacob fired a warning shot, the bullet embedding itself in the asphalt just inches from their feet. "Last chance to walk away," Jacob called out. The leader of the group responded by opening fire, the sound of gunshots echoing through the night. Jacob returned fire with precision, his years of training evident in every shot. One attacker fell, clutching his leg, while the others scrambled for cover. Inside, Elijah heard the commotion and grabbed a baseball bat. When one of the attackers broke through the door, Elijah swung with all his strength, knocking the man unconscious. By the time the chaos ended, sirens were wailing in the distance. 2 attackers were detained by police, while the rest fled. Jacob sat on the curb, his rifle resting across his knees. Blood seeped through his shirt where a bullet had grazed his side. But he was alive, and so was Elijah. "You're crazy, Pops," Elijah said, helping him to his feet. Jacob smirked. "Runs in the family." The ordeal solidified Elijah's resolve to see his case through. With Jacob's unwavering support, he won, exposing the corruption and dismantling the militia's influence. Back in Willow Creek, Jacob returned to his quiet life, though his pride in Elijah was far from quiet. The bond they shared had been forged in fire, and neither time nor distance could break it. Elijah's victory against the corrupt politician and his militia had sent ripples through the nation. The case became a landmark, inspiring many to fight against systemic injustice. By his 40s, Elijah was a renowned attorney, respected and admired, though his success brought new challenges. His work had drawn the attention of powerful enemies, but his resilience, deeply rooted in Jacob's teachings, carried him forward. Jacob, now in his 70s, spent most of his time at home in Willow Creek. His body was slower, but his mind remained sharp. He often followed Elijah's cases from the comfort of his living room, proud of the man his son had become. Meanwhile, Elijah had started a family of his own. His wife, Naomi, was a journalist who shared his passion for justice. Together, they raised 2 children, Grace, a spirited teenager with dreams of becoming a doctor, and Noah, a curious 8-year-old who adored his grandfather's stories about the Marines. One summer, Elijah decided to take his family to Willow Creek to visit Jacob. The trip was meant to be a peaceful retreat, but the past had a way of catching up. As they settled into Jacob's home, Elijah noticed a stack of unopened letters on the dining table. They were addressed to Jacob, but their return addresses were unfamiliar. "Pops, who's sending you these?" Elijah asked. Jacob hesitated before responding. "Just some old business. Nothing for you to worry about." Elijah's instincts told him otherwise. He opened one of the letters while Jacob was outside. The message was clear and chilling: "You should have stayed out of our affairs. Old men like you don't live forever." Elijah's heart sank. "Naomi," he called, showing her the letter. "Someone's threatening him." Naomi frowned. "Do you think it's connected to one of your cases?" "Could be. Or it might be someone from his past." That night, Elijah confronted Jacob. "Pops, you need to tell me what's going on. These threats are serious." Jacob sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of decades. "Remember the men who came after us in Chicago? I thought they'd all scattered after we took down their leader. But I was wrong. Some of them regrouped. They're trying to rebuild what we destroyed, and they think I'm an obstacle. They're not just trying to intimidate you, Pops. They could come here." Jacob nodded solemnly. "Then we'll be ready." The next morning, Elijah contacted a trusted friend in law enforcement while Jacob began fortifying the house. Together, they installed cameras, reinforced doors, and set up motion detectors. Grace and Noah were taught basic safety protocols, and Naomi kept her phone close at all times. A few nights later, the inevitable happened. Jacob's motion detectors triggered, their alarms piercing the silence. Jacob grabbed his rifle while Elijah armed himself with a pistol he had brought. "Naomi, take the kids and get to the basement," Elijah said firmly. The family moved with practiced urgency, the years of Jacob's military training evident in Elijah's calm under pressure. As Naomi ushered the children to safety, Jacob and Elijah took positions near the windows. Outside, figures moved in the shadows. There were at least 6 of them, their faces obscured by masks. One of them carried a crowbar, another a shotgun. Jacob's voice was low and steady. "They're testing us. Want to see how far we'll go?" "They'll find out soon enough," Elijah replied. The first thug approached the porch, his crowbar raised. Elijah fired a warning shot into the air, but the man didn't retreat. Instead, he swung the crowbar at the door, splintering the wood. Jacob didn't hesitate. From his position near the window, he fired a shot that grazed the man's arm. The thug howled in pain and stumbled back. "Anyone else want to try?" Jacob called out, his voice like thunder. The others opened fire, bullets peppering the walls of the house. Elijah and Jacob returned fire, their precision forcing the attackers to take cover behind trees and vehicles. In the chaos, one of the thugs attempted to circle around to the back of the house. Grace, watching from the basement window, spotted the intruder. "Dad! Someone's at the back!" she shouted. Elijah moved quickly, intercepting the man as he tried to pry open the back door. They grappled briefly before Elijah disarmed him, forcing him to flee into the night. Inside, Noah clung to Naomi, his eyes wide with fear. "Grandpa's not going to let them win, right?" he asked. "No," Naomi said firmly. "Grandpa and your dad are the strongest men I know." The standoff continued for nearly an hour, but the attackers were poorly organized. One by one, they retreated, unwilling to risk further injury or capture. When the last of them disappeared into the darkness, Jacob and Elijah stood in the doorway, weapons at their sides. "They'll be back," Jacob said, his voice heavy with certainty. "Let them," Elijah replied. "We'll be ready." The next day, law enforcement arrived to investigate. While the attackers hadn't left much evidence, Jacob and Elijah provided descriptions and recordings from the security cameras. As the family regrouped, Jacob sat on the porch with Grace and Noah. He told them stories about his time in the Marines, emphasizing the importance of courage and unity. "You two are stronger than you think," Jacob said. "You come from a long line of fighters." Grace smiled, her determination shining through. "I'm not scared, Grandpa. If they come back, I'll be ready too." Noah nodded, his small fists clenched. "Me too." That night, as Elijah watched his children sleep, he turned to Naomi. This is what Pops has always been teaching me, to stand tall. No matter what. Now it's my turn to teach them. Naomi placed a hand on his shoulder. You're doing a great job, Elijah. They're lucky to have you, and so is your father. Though the attack had shaken them, it also strengthened their bond as a family. Elijah knew the fight wasn't over, but with Jacob by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. Nearly a decade had passed since the attack on Jacob's house. Elijah, now in his 50s, had become one of the nation's most respected legal advocates for social justice. His work spanned cities and courtrooms, but his heart was never far from Willow Creek, where Jacob, still sharp, though slower on his feet, remained a grounding presence in his life. Jacob, now in his 80s, spent his days tending a small garden and sharing stories with his great-grandchildren. Grace had followed her dream of becoming a doctor and was now working in an inner-city hospital, while Noah, now a young man in his 20s, had enlisted in the Marines, inspired by his grandfather's legacy. One warm evening, the family gathered at Jacob's home to celebrate Noah's graduation from basic training. The house was alive with laughter, but beneath the joy, Jacob noticed a shadow in Noah's eyes. "What's on your mind, kid?" Jacob asked, pulling Noah aside. Noah hesitated, then said, "There's something going on, Grandpa. During training, I overheard some things about a private militia recruiting vets. They're the same people who came after us years ago." Jacob's jaw tightened. "The Iron Wolves?" Noah nodded. "They've rebranded, calling themselves the Vanguard, but it's the same core group. They've got funding now, real firepower. Some of the guys I trained with are thinking about joining." The news sent a chill through Jacob. He knew this was no coincidence. The Vanguard's resurgence was a direct response to the victories Elijah and his family had achieved over the years. "We need to shut this down before it grows out of control," Jacob said, his voice as resolute as ever. Elijah, overhearing the conversation, joined them. "If they're targeting soldiers, we need to expose them. I'll dig into their finances, find out who's backing them. And I'll handle the boots on the ground," Noah said. Jacob placed a hand on Noah's shoulder. "Not alone, you won't." Over the next few weeks, the family worked as a team. Elijah used his legal expertise to trace the Vanguard's operations, uncovering a network of shell companies funneling money to their cause. Meanwhile, Noah infiltrated one of their recruitment hubs, posing as a disillusioned soldier looking for purpose. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous the situation became. The Vanguard was no longer a ragtag group of criminals, they were organized, well-armed, and ruthless. One evening, Noah returned from a meeting with the Vanguard, his expression grave. "They're planning something big," he said. "A raid on a military armory. If they pull it off, they'll have enough weapons to arm hundreds." Jacob's face hardened. "We can't let that happen." The family devised a plan. While Elijah worked with law enforcement to secure the armory and intercept the Vanguard's funding, Jacob and Noah prepared for a direct confrontation. Grace, though initially hesitant, insisted on helping, using her medical training to provide support in case anyone was injured. The night of the planned raid arrived, bringing with it a tension that gripped the entire family. The armory, located on the outskirts of a neighboring city, was guarded by a small security team. Jacob, Noah, and Grace set up a base of operations nearby, monitoring the Vanguard's movements. As expected, the militia arrived under the cover of darkness, their convoy of trucks loaded with armed men. Jacob watched through binoculars, his sharp eyes scanning for weaknesses in their formation. "They're moving fast," he muttered. "Noah, we stick to the plan. You take the lead. Grace and I will cover you." Noah nodded, his face a mixture of determination and nerves. "Got it, Grandpa." With precision born of training and experience, they moved into position. Noah approached the convoy under the guise of being an ally, flashing the fake credentials he'd obtained during his infiltration. "What's your role in this?" one of the leaders asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Recon," Noah replied smoothly. "Wanted to make sure the route was clear." The leader nodded, but before the conversation could continue, Jacob opened fire from his vantage point, targeting the militia's tires and disabling their vehicles. The sudden chaos sent the Vanguard scrambling for cover. "Go!" Jacob barked into the radio. Noah sprang into action, disarming one of the guards and using his weapon to hold back the others. Grace, stationed nearby with a first aid kit, stayed out of sight but kept her focus sharp, ready to assist. The firefight was intense, bullets flying through the night as the vanguard attempted to regroup. Jacob, despite his age, moved with practiced efficiency, his shots precise and deliberate. One of the militia members lobbed a grenade toward their position, but Noah acted quickly, kicking it away before it could detonate. The explosion shook the ground, but no one was harmed. Meanwhile, Elijah, miles away in a secure location, coordinated with law enforcement to deploy reinforcements. He monitored the situation through a live feed Noah had set up, his heart pounding as he watched his father and son in the thick of the action. "Hold on," Elijah muttered, gripping the edge of his desk. "Just hold on a little longer." As reinforcements arrived, the vanguard realized they were outmatched. Their leader, a man known as Havoc, attempted to escape in one of the remaining trucks, but Jacob intercepted him, forcing the vehicle to crash into a ditch. Jacob approached the wreckage, his weapon trained on Havoc. "It's over," he said coldly. Havoc sneered, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. "You think this ends with me? You're fighting a war you can't win, old man." Jacob didn't flinch. "Maybe not. But I'll keep fighting anyway." By dawn, the armory was secure, and the vanguard's remaining members were in custody. As the family regrouped, the weight of the night's events settled over them. Grace patched up a cut on Noah's arm, her hand steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her. "You're lucky, you know that," she said, her tone a mix of exasperation and relief. Noah grinned. "Guess it runs in the family." Jacob, leaning against a nearby truck, watched his grandchildren with a quiet pride. Elijah soon arrived. His face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "You did good, Pops," Elijah said, clapping Jacob on the shoulder. Jacob smiled faintly. "So did you. This family doesn't back down." Though the battle was won, they all knew the fight against hate and corruption was far from over. But together, they were unstoppable, a family forged in resilience, bound by a legacy of courage. Another 20 years passed, and the Trenton family's legacy had spread across the country like wildfire. Elijah, now in his 70s, had transitioned into an advisory role, mentoring young attorneys who sought to follow in his footsteps. His life's work had helped reshape laws, break systemic barriers, and inspire a new generation of leaders. Though his stride had slowed, his mind remained as sharp as ever. Jacob, the patriarch, had passed on years earlier, leaving behind a void in the family that no one could truly fill. Yet, his wisdom lived on in the lessons he'd imparted to Elijah, Grace, Noah, and their children. His memory was honored every day, particularly by Noah, who had become a decorated Marine officer. And Grace, now a prominent surgeon. The family's story had evolved into a multi-generational tapestry, but the world was far from settled. Hate groups like the Vanguard had fractured but never fully disappeared. Their remnants lurked in the shadows, waiting for moments of societal unrest to re-emerge. It was Noah's youngest son, David, who would encounter the resurgence of their family's old adversaries. A skilled cryptographer for the Department of Defense, David stumbled upon a coded message during a routine analysis. At first glance, it seemed innocuous, just chatter between small extremist cells. But as David unraveled the encryption, he discovered something far more sinister: the Vanguard was back. Stronger than ever, with plans to execute a large-scale attack on the nation's capital. David, a man of precision and principle, immediately alerted his superiors. However, as he dug deeper, he found evidence that the group had infiltrated parts of the military and law enforcement, complicating efforts to root them out. Unsure of whom to trust, David turned to the one person he knew could help him navigate the storm: his father, Noah. "Dad, this isn't just another conspiracy theory," David said, pacing the room during a late-night visit to his father's home. "I've seen the data. They're planning something big, and they've got inside help." Noah leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of calm as he processed the information. "Have you taken this to your higher-ups?" "I have," David replied. "But I can't shake the feeling that some of them are compromised. If I push too hard, I could end up exposing myself, and losing the chance to stop this." Noah nodded. "Then we go outside the system." Noah reached out to Elijah, who, despite his advanced age, still wielded influence in legal and political circles. Together, they began to formulate a plan. Elijah would leverage his connections to quietly alert trusted allies, while Noah and David worked to identify the Vanguard's leadership and disrupt their operations. As the days passed, the gravity of the situation became clear. The vanguard had amassed an arsenal far more sophisticated than anything the family had encountered before. They were no longer a fringe group, they were a well-oiled machine, capable of causing mass devastation. The turning point came when David intercepted a live message detailing the time and location of the planned attack. It was set to occur during a high-profile event in Washington, D.C., where political leaders from around the world would gather. The stakes had never been higher. "This is it," David said, showing the decoded message to Noah and Elijah. "We've got 48 hours to stop them." Noah immediately mobilized his network, contacting old military friends and trusted operatives who could help. Grace, though retired from active medical practice, volunteered to join them, knowing her skills might be needed in the field. The family converged in D.C., each member prepared to play their part. Elijah, using his political clout, coordinated with key security personnel to secure the event venue. David worked behind the scenes to identify and isolate the vanguard's communications, effectively cutting off their ability to coordinate. Noah, ever the soldier, prepared to confront the group head-on if necessary. The day of the event arrived, bringing with it an air of tension and urgency. The venue was a sprawling convention center, packed with dignitaries, journalists, and security personnel. Unknown to most, the vanguard had planted explosives throughout the building, intending to detonate them remotely. David, monitoring the situation from a nearby command center, intercepted a signal from the vanguard's leader, a man known only as Spectre. "They're moving," David reported into his headset. "They've activated the trigger, but I'm blocking the signal. We need boots on the ground to neutralize them now." Noah and Grace were already inside the building, disguised as event staff. Armed with concealed weapons and tactical gear, they moved swiftly through the crowded halls, guided by David's directions. "West Wing," David said. "They've got 3 operatives near the ballroom entrance. Take them out quietly." Noah nodded to Grace. "Stay close to me." Grace smirked. "You're not the only one who's seen action, Dad." As they approached the operatives, Noah struck first, disarming one with a swift blow before subduing the second with a chokehold. Grace used a taser to incapacitate the third, her movements precise and efficient. Meanwhile, Elijah coordinated with law enforcement to evacuate key targets without causing a panic. His years of experience in navigating crises proved invaluable as he directed the flow of people out of harm's way. Back at the command center, David discovered a second layer to the plan. The explosives were rigged with a manual override, allowing Spectre to detonate them if the remote trigger failed. "He's here," David realized. "Spectre's inside the building." Noah's voice crackled over the radio. "Where?" "South Wing, near the service elevators. He's got 2 bodyguards with him." Noah and Grace made their way to the location, finding Spectre attempting to escape. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Spectre's guards opened fire, but Noah, with years of battlefield experience, outmaneuvered them. Grace provided cover, her steady aim forcing Spectre to retreat. As he reached for the manual detonator, Noah tackled him to the ground, wrenching the device from his grasp. "It's over," Noah growled, pinning Spectre to the floor. By the end of the day, the vanguard's plot had been foiled, and their leadership dismantled. The Trenton family once again proved that courage and unity could overcome even the gravest threats. As they regrouped, Elijah placed a hand on Noah's shoulder. "Dad would have been proud of you today." Noah smiled faintly, his gaze turning to David. "Proud of all of us." Another 25 years passed, and the world had shifted in ways the Trenton family could never have imagined. The rise of new technologies, global movements for justice, and changing power dynamics brought progress, but with it came an ever-present undercurrent of division and unrest. By this time, the youngest generation of the Trenton family had stepped into the world as adults, ready to forge their own legacies. David, now a highly regarded cybersecurity expert and father of 3, was teaching his oldest daughter, Maya, the intricacies of encryption and coding. She was just 19 but had already shown a remarkable aptitude for technology, a talent David proudly nurtured. Meanwhile, Noah had retired from the Marines and spent his days mentoring young recruits and writing about his experiences. Grace, still a beacon of strength, was leading a medical nonprofit focused on underserved communities. And Elijah, now in his 90s, lived a quieter life but remained the family's guiding light, always ready with wisdom drawn from decades of fighting for justice. One sunny afternoon, as the family gathered at the sprawling estate David had built, a sense of peace settled over them. Generations of Trentons, from toddlers to elders, laughed and reminisced. Maya, sitting beside her great-grandfather Elijah, asked, "What's the most important thing you've learned in all these years?" "Grandpa." Elijah's eyes, though weary with age, sparkled with the fire of his youth. "That courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about doing what's right, even when the world tells you it's wrong." Maya smiled, absorbing the words, unaware that soon her own courage would be tested. 3 months later, Maya found herself staring at a screen in her father's home office. David had been traveling for work, leaving Maya to manage a routine security check on one of his systems. What she found was anything but routine. A hidden folder had been flagged, containing encrypted files. Maya, intrigued and confident in her skills, broke through the layers of security. What she uncovered chilled her to the core: blueprints for a large-scale cyber attack targeting the nation's power grid. The files bore the emblem of a long-dormant group, the Vanguard. Maya immediately called her father, who answered from a hotel room in London. "Dad, it's them," she said, her voice trembling. "The Vanguard. They're planning something huge." David's face darkened. "Are you sure? I found encrypted files on one of your flagged servers. They've been hiding in plain sight, using a system you designed to track extremist chatter." "This isn't just chatter, Dad. It's an operation." David processed the information quickly. "Don't tell anyone else. I'm catching the next flight home. Stay alert and keep the system secure." When David returned, he reviewed the files alongside Maya. The Vanguard's plan wasn't just to disrupt the power grid, it was to use the chaos to seize control of critical infrastructure, plunging the country into darkness and destabilizing the government. The scale of the operation was staggering, and the family realized they had mere weeks to stop it. David reached out to Noah and Grace, who both insisted on getting involved. Grace mobilized her nonprofit's resources to help prepare emergency medical responses, while Noah reconnected with old military contacts to gather intelligence. Elijah, though physically frail, provided strategic advice from the sidelines, his mind still razor-sharp. But it was Maya who emerged as the key player. Her understanding of the Vanguard's digital tactics allowed her to predict their moves, track their communications, and dismantle parts of their network. She worked tirelessly, often late into the night, guided by her father's expertise and her great-grandfather's wisdom. One evening, as Maya sat in front of her computer, her phone buzzed with an anonymous message: "We know who you are. Stop interfering, or you'll regret it." She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. "What's wrong?" David asked, stepping into the room. "They know about me," Maya said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. David placed a hand on her shoulder. "They've threatened every generation of this family. And every time, we've stood our ground. You're no different." The final confrontation came 2 days before the Vanguard's planned attack. Maya had tracked their command center to an abandoned warehouse in a remote part of the state. The family decided to act before it was too late. Noah, despite his age, led the ground team with the precision of a seasoned Marine. David stayed in a mobile command unit with Maya, relaying real-time information. Grace coordinated emergency services, ensuring they were ready for any fallout. As the team approached the warehouse, they encountered heavy resistance. The Vanguard had fortified their position, and a fierce firefight erupted. Noah, moving with the agility of a man half his age, directed his team with precision, taking down key targets and clearing a path to the main server room. Inside, Maya guided David through dismantling the Vanguard system remotely, racing against the clock to stop the attack. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as warnings flashed on the screen. "They've started the countdown," Maya said, her voice tight with urgency. "I need more time." "Noah," David called over the radio. "We need that server offline now." "I'm on it," Noah replied. He and his team breached the server room, only to find it guarded by Vanguard operatives. A brutal fight ensued, with Noah taking down the last operative just as Maya shouted, "I've got it." The screen went dark, signaling the attack had been neutralized. Relief swept over the family, but the cost had been high. Noah, though victorious, had sustained a gunshot wound. As he was carried out on a stretcher, he smiled weakly at Maya. "You did it, kid. Grandpa would be proud." In the weeks that followed, the story of the Vanguard's defeat made headlines, though the Trentons' role remained largely unknown. They preferred it that way, content to work in the shadows, fighting for what was right. One evening, as the family gathered around Elijah's bedside, he spoke with a voice both frail and powerful. "This family has faced more than its share of battles," he said. "But through it all, we've stood together. Never forget where you come from, or what you're capable of." Elijah passed peacefully that night, leaving behind a legacy of courage, resilience, and unwavering love. The Trentons continued to carry that legacy forward, each generation building on the strength of those who came before. And though the world remained imperfect, one thing was certain: whenever darkness loomed, the Trentons would be there, standing tall, ready to fight.